Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Diane, for introducing me. As Diane said, my name is Kristen Stratton. I am a special education advocate. I am also a hard of hearing adult. I grew up using English, and when 2 of my 3 children were identified as deaf, we chose to learn American Sign Language, and that's the chosen language of my 2 deaf sons. One of my deaf sons is deaf with additional disabilities, so he would be considered deaf disabled or deaf plus. So I have spent a lot of my professional time learning about special education and advocating for the deaf community. And so I would like to share that wealth of knowledge with you today and hopefully make the assessment and eligibility process a little less intimidating and a little more easy to understand. If this is your first or third or fifth time going through the process, I think it's always a little overwhelming. So I hopefully will provide you with some insight and give you some confidence to go through that process so that you feel like you can make informed decisions for the benefit of your child. All right, go ahead, Jermaine. Okay, so we're primarily going to be discussing the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, because that is the law that allows us to conduct assessments of children with disabilities to determine if they are eligible for special education and related services in the public school system. So that's very often abbreviated as IDEA. And then if we decide, yes, there is a disability and this child does need services in order to access their education in the public school setting, we develop what's called an IEP, or an individualized education plan. That's what we call it here in California. In the federal law, it's sometimes called the Individualized Education Program. It's the same thing. It's just a difference in vocabulary, but it's the same exact document. The agency responsible for developing that document is called the LEA, the Local Educational Agency. That's typically here in California, the school district. Sometimes that will be your local county office of education, but mostly it's your local school district where you live. And then what that IEP document is supposed to develop is a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. So it's all the building blocks that we're going to put together to make sure that the child has access to what they're entitled to under that IDEA law. And that is a free and appropriate public education, and we call that a FAPE. We're going to briefly discuss the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and an alternative to an IEP called a 504 plan. That's if a child's found not eligible for an IEP. And then we're going to talk about briefly the Americans with Disabilities Act and how all 3 laws, IDEA, the Rehabilitation Act, and the Americans with Disability Act, are all interconnected. And then the terminology that NorCal Deaf Services uses to describe deaf with additional disabilities is deaf plus. So I'll be using that term today, and that's to describe deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind individuals who may have or who are known to have developmental delays or disabilities. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. So how do we get to an IEP? So there are several steps in the process. We don't just immediately jump to writing that document. We have to go through a very systematic process. It starts with a referral, and then there has to be consent given by that child's parent or guardian. And then we go through the assessment and evaluation process. That means there's testing involved of that child. And then we're going to have a meeting. We're going to have a formal business meeting where we sit down and we discuss the findings that were an outcome of all of those assessments. And that's typically what's called an IEP meeting. Although now in California, we're calling that an eligibility determination meeting. And then if the child is determined to qualify for an IEP, meaning that based on how the law is written, that child meets the eligibility criteria, then we're going to develop the IEP document. And then that document's going to be presented to the parents or guardians for consent. Here in California, parental consent is required. So that is the basic fundamentals of the IEP process. It's not a quick process. It takes typically 60 days to go through this process from start to finish, not including the time to refer the child. So it can typically take about 75 days from the 15 days that the school has to consider referral, 60 days to test, and then hold the meeting to say, hey, yeah, let's go over all these testing and findings. And then we have to develop the IEP document. So 75 days is sometimes a conservative estimate. That can be really hard, especially if that child is struggling and is already enrolled in school. Maybe they were late identified as deaf or hard of hearing. And, we're trying to get them services right away. So, this is by no means a quick process, but it's a very important process. And we have to go through the necessary steps to make sure that we're adequately assessing the child and making sure that we're identifying all of their needs. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what do assessments do? Well, they identify disabilities based on how the educational code is written. So that's how the IDEA law is written. That is our educational code. We're going to use multiple measures, meaning that we're not just going to do one test and decide, okay, little Johnny qualifies or doesn't qualify. We're going to do multiple tests and different ways that we look at Johnny to decide, yes, based on how the law is written, Johnny does in fact meet the criteria to qualify for an IEP or he does not. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to use the educational code to determine whether or not that child has a disability. Through that assessment process, we're going to identify the student's strengths and weaknesses. Now, sometimes that can be really hard to sit and discuss in a meeting for parents. It's really difficult sometimes to see in writing and to be told by professionals that your child is struggling. And then it can also be really nice to hear that, hey, your child has some real strengths. We're seeing some really good things. We're seeing the same things that you see that are really, really good about your child. But that can still be very overwhelming to hear in a 1 to 2 hour meeting. But that is part of the assessment process, just to go through and identify what those strengths and weaknesses are. And then we're also going to hopefully get data. We want things that we can measure, that we can point to either a percentage or something that gives us a really hard baseline that says, okay, this is where Johnny is right now at this moment in time. in order to make an informed decision about how to help Johnny move forward and do better in the future. And without that data, without that concrete information, it's really hard for us to make really informed decisions. Assessments aren't perfect, but it's our goal to try to get as much good information as possible. Assessments do not diagnose medical conditions. While school psychologists might use some of the same assessments that maybe a medical doctor might use, or they might consider some of the same things that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, might use to kind of consider eligibility. They're not going to, at the end of this process, say, Johnny has ADHD and have a medical diagnosis. They're only going to look at the educational code. They're not going to look at just one single test or one single measure and say, yes, your child qualifies or does not qualify. The law specifies that we have to consider multiple measures when we're doing assessments. Most importantly, assessments do not predict your child's future. I have sat in many meetings where we have seen assessments from 3 years ago where the child's scores were very, very low. And then 3 years later, that child is just, you could not believe the difference, night and day difference. So it's never a predictor of your child's future. It's only a snapshot of how they're doing at that moment in that day when that test was conducted. And lastly, the assessments do not determine your child's worth. So although it may be difficult to read or understand some of the things about your child that might be discussed in those meetings, it's really important to determine that you are the ultimate decider of what your child's worth is. You decide how much they're loved, and at the end of the day, someone telling you that your child is having a hard time at school, having a hard time learning, that's just their professional opinion, but that doesn't make them any less valuable. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so referral and consent. So who can make a referral for assessment? If your child is receiving early intervention services through a regional center, traditionally they're going to make the referral prior to that child turning 3 to the local school district. And that should be a fairly seamless transition for your child to get then assessed by the time they turn 3 years old to see if they continue to qualify for services through the local school district. So regional center should be making that referral. School staff has a very strong obligation to make a referral. Let's talk about little Johnny again. If little Johnny is appearing to struggle in school, and that doesn't just mean grades, that can mean behaviorally or socially, emotionally, they have an obligation to make a referral to the administration, to the school psychologist, and say, hey, I think Johnny needs some help. I suspect Johnny may have a disability. And then you as a parent or a guardian may make that referral yourself. All you have to do is suspect that something's going on with your child that might be an indicator that your child has a disability. You don't need a confirmation from the doctor. You just need to suspect it, and you can make that request. How to do that is to always make the request in writing. What I always tell my clients and the parents I support is that if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. Always put your request for assessment in writing. Once you do that, you're just going to write a simple letter or an email. Email is honestly the best way to do it because it's simple, it's fast, and it's time-stamped. And you can just send it to your teacher or your principal. And you could just say, I think Johnny has a disability, he's struggling in, X, Y, Z ways, all the things that you're concerned about. And I want an assessment plan within 15 days. And so by law in California, now this is specific to our state only. So if you're talking to your friend in Colorado, do not tell them to expect a response in 15 days because that's a different law in that state. But here in California, the school district has an obligation to provide a assessment plan to the parent or guardian within 15 days. An assessment plan is just basically to gain your written consent to go ahead and begin the evaluation process to determine if that child does in fact qualify or not for special education via the IEP. Once you sign that assessment plan, you say, okay, thank you for giving me the assessment plan. I've looked it over. I agree. I want you to do these tests on Johnny. You sign it, you return that assessment plan to the school. They have then 60 calendar days to do those tests and hold a meeting to review those assessments. Now, does the school have the right to say no? Yes. Do they do that often? No, because their obligation under the law to assess children and find and identify children with disabilities is very, very high. They have to provide what's called prior written notice and say, this is why we don't think Johnny has a disability, and they have to explain in very great detail why it is they do not think they need to assess that child. And they would get in big trouble with the state of California if they were found to be in violation of their what's called child find obligation. So school districts have an obligation under the law to identify, locate, and evaluate all children with disabilities who may be eligible for special education and related services. And all they have to do is have a suspicion of a disability. That doesn't mean the child has to have a diagnosis from a doctor. So it's a pretty low threshold that triggers that child find obligation. So it's pretty rare that a school will refuse to assess unless they've already done so and found that child ineligible in a fairly recent amount of time. So most of the time, if a parent requests assessment, you're going to get an assessment plan within 15 days. I will say sometimes what I do have parents say is, oh, I requested an assessment and the school wants to hold a SST meeting. That's a student support team meeting, and discuss my concerns first. That's fine. You can go to that meeting. However, they're still obligated to respond to your requests for assessment within 15 days. And holding that meeting or not does not change that obligation. So they still must assess that child if there's a suspected disability. Okay, next slide, please. So now this is an example of an assessment plan. Every district is going to have a different format, so yours might look incredibly different to this one. However, the reason why I'm sharing this is because this is demonstrating the 8 categories under which we look for areas under which we assess. So you're going to get an assessment plan that says Johnny is going to be assessed. We're going to look at these following areas. And if you are unable to see the screen, it's a piece of paper that has a list of the following areas: academic achievement, social, adaptive, behavioral, and emotional, processing, perceptual, modal development, communication development, cognitive development, health and developmental, and then post-secondary transition. So those are just all of the areas that we're going to have professionals that are qualified to assess in those areas. And those areas are aligned with all of the areas of suspected disability. And I'm going to talk about that later. So don't get too overwhelmed just yet. But essentially, this is what you would be asked to sign consent to. And next to each of those areas, typically you'll see a number, like a number 1, a number 2, a number 4, a number 5. And at the bottom, there will be kind of a key that defines what each of those numbers mean. And usually each of those numbers corresponds to a specific professional. For example, a number 1 would be a special education teacher or the psychologist. A number 4 might be an occupational therapist. And you might not understand what any of those professions mean. So if you are the first-time parent and you have no idea what any of these areas mean, you have no idea what any of those professions mean, whoever gives this to you, you ask them, please explain this document to me, because in order for you to sign consent to this, you have to understand it. So I would encourage you to make sure that whoever is asking you to sign anything, if you don't understand the document, ask them to explain it to you and make sure that all of your concerns are being addressed. If you have concerns that your child, if you are a parent that wants your child to use spoken language and there's no speech pathologist listed on an assessment plan, then you would say, hey, is everyone on here that ought to be on here? I don't see this person listed. So make sure you're asking those questions. Don't be afraid to ask for people to explain things to you in detail, because at the end of the day, you're signing legal documents when you sign these sorts of things. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what is the goal of the assessment process? We're supposed to look at what's called all areas of suspected disability. That is our obligation under IDEA, our obligation under the law. So that means that we have to look at every single area. And again, I'm going to talk about what all of those areas are. And there are 13 of them. We have 13 areas that we can consider as an IEP team. And we have to ask ourselves when we're talking about what areas we need to assess, which of them we are considering for that child. Now, sometimes we don't know all of them until we start doing assessment and things pop up and we go, oh, we should probably look in this area too. So again, it's suspected disability, but that's our obligation under the law. Now, in the assessment process, we need to identify 3 specific things. We need to identify whether a student has a disability. And again, that's using the educational code. I'm sorry, can everyone please make sure they're on mute? I'm hearing some other people and I want to make sure that anyone who's listening can have the best access. Okay, thank you so much. We want to make sure we're identifying whether a student has a disability, if there are needs related to that disability, and if there are related services required to support the student to be involved in and progress in the general curriculum. So those are the standards that we're looking at. So again, the threshold for assessment is low. We don't need doctor's notes. You only need a reasonable concern. It's not just about grades either. We have students who have very, very good grades who have IEPs. We also consider the physical, the mental, the emotional, behavioral, the adaptive, vocational skills. We're looking at the whole child. And their ability to access their educational environment. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so who is on the assessment team? It depends on the areas of suspected disability. The law requires that persons who are knowledgeable about the person's disability conduct those assessments. So persons must be competent in the mode of communication and must have knowledge and understanding of the student's cultural and ethnic background. So in the case of a deaf child, that's very important if we're considering their language needs. If we have a child, for example, whose primary mode of communication is using spoken English, we would be looking for someone who's has training in assessing children with hearing loss, but who is proficient in administering tests in English. If that child uses American Sign Language, the most qualified person would be a credentialed school psychologist who can administer the tests in American Sign Language directly. If that's not an option, California regulations do require an interpreter be used when necessary, but it's always preferable to have the assessor, the person who's conducting the assessment, administering the test, do so in that child's native language if that is an available option. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a pretty big list. If you can't see the screen, on the screen we have a very long list of people who are potential IEP team members. This can include a credentialed school psychologist. Now in California, that's someone with a master's degree or higher who has a appropriate credential as a school psychologist. It does not have to be someone who has a doctorate degree in psychology. It would be a general education teacher if a general education program is being considered for that student. A special education teacher. Usually for school administrator, it depends on the program, but we're going to typically see a school site principal. Sometimes someone from the district office will be represented. That might be someone called a program specialist. If your child is maybe going to attend a county deaf and hard of hearing program, that person might be there to represent the county office of education. You might have an occupational therapist. If you're not familiar with that, that's a person who's going to be addressing fine motor skills. They also help with sensory needs. A speech language pathologist can address both spoken language, but also if they're at a signing program or a deaf school, that person can also help address sign language as long as they're a fluent signer. An AAC specialist, that's an augmentative and alternative communication specialist. That would be someone who helps a student who uses assistive technology or a communication device to communicate. We might see that in children with additional disabilities. For example, a child who's deaf who has cerebral palsy might have difficulty using American Sign Language in their expressive language because maybe they don't have the fine motor skills, but receptively how they understand language, they use American Sign Language, but they get frustrated and they struggle to use their hands to sign. So they might use a device, a communication device, to express themselves. So we want someone to be involved that can speak to that. We'd want a deaf and hard of hearing itinerant teacher if that child is not in a deaf and hard of hearing program. If they're in what we would call a mainstream program or a traditional school that's for hearing children, then there's typically going to be called an itinerant teacher, meaning that that teacher travels from site to service all of the deaf and hard of hearing school students within that district. That would be the same for a vision itinerant teacher. They're going to travel from site to service those students. an audiologist, an orthopedic impairment specialist. That's someone who's going to service students who might have a disability like cerebral palsy, who might require some specialized equipment. An orientation and mobility specialist. Those are people who help students with low vision or blindness, for example, teach them how to navigate their environment, or maybe who use a wheelchair, teach them how to navigate the school environment. Adaptive physical education. Those are for students who need goals related to PE, but maybe would have difficulty participating in general education PE. So all of these people are potential IEP team members. So we're not just looking at deafness and hard of hearing. We're looking at the whole child. And then you can bring other people with you. You can bring an advocate. You can bring a friend. You can bring a neighbor. Other people that might be present might also include a autism or behavior specialist, an assistive technology specialist. If you are requiring the support of an ASL interpreter or a Spanish interpreter or another foreign language, or you need real-time captioning, all of those things must be provided to you at no cost. If you need an interpreter to participate as a parent, the school must provide that to you. They cannot ask you to bring your own interpreter. And I also have student as a IEP team member. When your child is old enough or can participate, even if it's just for a few minutes, I encourage you to have them participate to the extent possible. We're talking about them and their life, and it's very important that they learn self-advocacy to the extent that they can, and they should absolutely be participating in their IEP meetings. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. All right, so how do we assess? Again, we're using multiple measures. We're not just relying on single measures. So typically we're going to start with what we call standardized assessments. These are what we consider to be valid and reliable and are administered in accordance with any instructions provided, meaning that these are tests that were developed usually, at universities, and we studied how the outcomes were going to be, apply to populations of specific groups of people, and determined how that defined what normal was within that population. And I say normal in quotations, meaning, that's a very relative term, but that's what standardized assessments are meant to determine. That's how we determine whether or not someone has a strength or weaknesses. We are drawing comparisons between what we expect from someone who would be considered non-disabled, and drawing comparisons to a population that is being identified as disabled. So, there are strict rules and parameters when we're administering standardized assessments. We're looking to find a quantifiable or a measurable answer. We want a percentage. We want a score. We want a number. Sometimes we're not going to get the answer that we want. Sometimes kids don't perform the way we want them to. And that's, okay. These are very unique circumstances that we're asking children to perform under. I would say, as an advocate, a lot of the times what I will ask in meetings is if a child did not understand the instructions, or maybe was just not feeling like doing what the assessor was asking them to do that day, if that assessor then stopped asking the student to do the test in the manner that it's required to be done, and then try to elicit some information from them in a non-standardized way, just to see how much that child really does know. And even though that's not something we can maybe get a score from, I think that that's good practice, because at the end of the day, it's more important for us to know what a child can do than to just get a score. So I think that that's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so then we also have rating scales and inventories. These are things that typically teachers will fill out, parents or guardians will fill out. Sometimes you can take them to your private therapist or your doctor. It just depends on what we're measuring. But these are things that are questionnaires or surveys or checklists. Basically, we're looking to measure things like adaptive skills. Those are, daily living skills, or we're looking at behavioral health, or communication skills, sensory processing, and social and emotional. Those are things that we typically look at when we're doing rating scales or inventories. And then direct observation is really important. If a child is new to the IEP process and they're transitioning to an IEP about to turn 3, we're not going to see them in the classroom. But once the child is in school, we get a lot of opportunity to do observation in the classroom, on the playground. We should be looking at them in multiple environments. What really irritates me is when I read an observation in an assessment report and all of these same observation windows are in everybody's report. They all observe the child within the same 20 minutes, and it's all Johnny eating a peanut butter sandwich during lunch and nothing happened. And I want everyone to go do observations at different times of the day, so we get a whole picture of Johnny's day and not just the occupational therapist and the speech therapist and the psychologist's account of what it looks like when Johnny eats a peanut butter sandwich. So we really want to get a really strong picture of what the student's day looks like. And then during testing, what it looks like can include the teacher, if a child has a one-on-one aide, that aide might be involved in the assessment process. The interpreter, if there's an ASL interpreter or a foreign language interpreter, that person should be involved in the process. It just really depends. And then a lot of times parents will ask if they can be involved. If the child is young, like if we're looking at a preschooler, yes, typically the parents will be there. But once the child's enrolled in school, they're transitional kindergarten or kindergarten and up, these assessments are taking place during school hours, and except for very extenuating circumstances, the parents are not going to be there when testing is taking place. And most importantly, direct assessment in the native language is always best. That's just best practice. Sometimes that's just not feasible. Sometimes our families are living in very rural areas where we just don't have the resources to find experts who are trained and fluent in ASL. And, it's like trying to find a unicorn to find these, very skilled people, or maybe medically that child cannot travel to, the local deaf school for assessment, or the wait list is just too long and we just can't wait that long. There are reasons why sometimes we just have to do our best. But then one of the things that we definitely should do in those reports is say, okay, we did our best, but these are the reasons why all of these reports should be interpreted with caution, because of X, Y, Z reasons. We couldn't necessarily get the best information. Okay, go ahead to the next slide, please. So this is just one of many examples of things you might see on an assessment report. You do not have to be a statistician to understand your child's assessment reports. They will be explained to you. And if you feel like the psychologist or whoever is presenting their assessment report is rushing through and just rattling off scores, and you are just like, I don't know what you're saying right now, you might as well be just, speaking a fifth, sixth, seventh language because I have no idea what you're saying. Tell them to stop and break it down for you. That's their job. But this is an example of the most common ways that we interpret results. I'm not going to go through it in detail because every single score that you're going to see is very specific to the specific test that is going to get administered. And then sometimes it within that specific test, halfway through that test, the way we score switches. And so what is considered average will then switch halfway through. So it's just not even worth someone who's new to this process trying to memorize what's considered a standard score. That's all going to be in your child's report, but it's just kind of good to get familiar with this bell. It's called the bell curve. And this is just basically how we define what falls within an average range, and what's considered above average and what's considered below average. And then typically when we're trying to determine eligibility, what we're really looking at is a lot of what's below average, meaning what are the areas that we need to identify and support in order to enable that child to make progress in their educational environment. Okay. So assessment tools, they matter. It's really important when we assess a child to try to determine their appropriate eligibility category the first time we assess and with reliable data. We really want to try to avoid misidentifying a child, meaning either finding them ineligible or misidentifying them, meaning finding them eligible in the wrong category. A lot of times children who are deaf or hard of hearing, especially children who perhaps didn't have access to language for a very critical time in their early childhood, can get misidentified as having either intellectual disability or other learning disabilities that perhaps they don't have. It's really more of a manifestation of them just not having adequate access to language. So it's super important that we're considering everything with regard to the child's access to language when we're talking about deaf children. That is a critical focus. And then when it comes to actually choosing which test the psychologist or the speech pathologist or whoever is on the assessment team, but really most importantly, I would say the school psychologist, what tests they're going to choose. It's really important that they're choosing tests to the best extent possible that are appropriate for deaf and hard of hearing children. Success for Kids with Hearing Loss is a really good resource. So I would encourage you to share that website. I won't go through it today, but it's a really great list of all the kind of deaf and hard of hearing, maybe not perfect, but more friendly tests that can be used for our children. I would encourage you to share that with your school district, with anyone who's working with your children. It's a really good resource. Okay, preparing for assessment, ask questions. It's okay to ask your team members what is their experience with children like yours. Make sure, hey, is an interpreter going to be made available to my child? Are the assessment protocols standardized for deaf and hard of hearing children? And what I mean by that is when those tests were developed at whatever university or whatever organization developed that test, did they test it on children who are deaf and hard of hearing? And most of the time the answer is no. But again, we do our best. Nonverbal assessments often get offered to our kids. Nonverbal meaning they're developed for children who are non-speaking. Often those are great for children who have language delays or language disability, but are typically normed, meaning developed for children who have auditory access to language, and not necessarily designed for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And again, it's critical that you emphasize to your IEP team that they consider your child's language history. Are they signing? Are they using spoken language? Are they using both? Did they not have access to signed or spoken language for a critical amount of time? Do they use, cochlear implant or hearing aids? Was there delayed access to those things? We really have to consider all of that history when we're talking about assessment. And then if your child needs accommodations for their testing, discuss those things in advance. Things like listening breaks or, visual breaks if they're a signer. If that child is in an assessment when masks are being required, are they using clear masks? All of those things need to be agreed in advance. A lot of the times these assessments, they try to schedule them for 3 hours in one day. And for some kids, that's just way too much. Maybe your kid has a seizure disorder, or maybe you have a deaf autistic child who needs breaks after 30 minutes. Tell them that and advocate for your child to get those accommodations. Okay. All right. Preparing for the eligibility meeting. We want to request copies of the reports. Yes, you have a right to get copies of those reports before you meet with that team to go over them. And sometimes they'll say, oh, well, we're not going to have them ready. Then you say, okay, well, then we can reschedule the meeting. The law heavily emphasizes the parent's right to what's called meaningfully participate. And that is super important. The law really prioritizes the parent's right to participate in IEP meetings. And when that is not done, it's a big deal. So make sure it's clear to your IEP team that you expect copies of those reports in advance. And especially if you're a parent who needs an interpreter, that's going to really help you get an opportunity to go over everything, so you're not hearing or trying to read everything for the first time in a meeting. Make sure that your interpreter will be provided, and that interpreter will be there free of charge. That is the law. If your child is participating in the meeting, they also are entitled to an interpreter. If you're bringing a guest as an advocate or a friend who needs an interpreter, they're also entitled to an interpreter free of charge. That's part of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the schools are obligated to fund that interpreter. You should ask who's going to be at that meeting and what is their role. Again, review those reports ahead of time. Make notes. If you are not a native English speaker, you have a right to receive copies of reports in your native language. Now, are they going to do that? It's a real problem. I'd be lying to you if I said they were going to do that and be very good about complying with that part of the law. It's a real problem. If you're having a hard time getting them to translate documents into your native language, I encourage you to contact an advocacy agency like Disability Rights California, or filing a complaint with the Department of Education, because that's that's a real issue. But just know that that is a right you have. If you want to audio record a meeting, you have to provide 24 hours of advance notice. And also you have the right to bring anyone with you who's knowledgeable of an IEP, whether that's a friend, an advocate, a teacher, a neighbor, and their interpreter. They can have one. Okay. So there are 13 eligibility categories in the federal law: autism, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance. Hearing impairment is what it's called in the federal law. I apologize. I know that's not the culturally preferred term. The federal law has not caught up to, the state of California yet, but the state of California has adopted the term hard of hearing. Intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, which is kind of a catch-all, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. And the three most common in California are autism, other health impairment, and specific learning disability. And then what we have in are considered low incidence disabilities, meaning they occur in a very small percentage of the a small percentage of the population, are deafblindness, deafness, hard of hearing, orthopedic impairment, and visual impairment. And low incidence disabilities have special funding attached to them that school districts receive additional funds for students identified as having low incidence disabilities. Okay, so hard of hearing. Again, unfortunately, the federal educational code still refers to this as hearing impairment. So in meetings, you might still have professionals use that term. So I just want to make you aware, but in California, they do use the term hard of hearing. And this means any hearing impairment whether there's permanent or fluctuating, that adversely affects the child's educational performance, but that is not included under the definition of deafness. Now, I want you to take note that there is no decibel level in this definition. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in meetings, especially when there's a student with unilateral hearing loss, and they've been told, okay, well, because the child has one good ear, the child doesn't qualify for an IEP. Wrong. The standard here is whether that child's education is adversely impacted. And honestly, the argument could be made that any level of hearing loss is educationally significant. I like this. There's a visual. I don't know if you cannot see the screen. There's a brick wall, and that brick wall is missing pieces of brick, and on top of it is a little boy standing there, and all the missing brick is representative of a student with hearing loss missing pieces, and that would represent all of the missing information of a student in a hearing program or in a program where there wasn't adequate access to language, because while that student might have all the necessary skills to learn, if that student doesn't have access to information, there's going to be gaps in their learning. So it doesn't matter if that child is hearing 8 out of 10 words, that loss is cumulative. So any hearing loss is significant educationally. Deafness. So the educational code defines deafness as a hearing impairment that is so severe that the child is impaired in processing linguistic information through hearing with or without amplification. And again, that adversely affects the child's educational performance. So this standard is not only looking at the educational impact, but also the ability to process linguistic information, so spoken language access. So that's how we're differentiating the two eligibility categories of hard of hearing or deafness, and that would be the access to spoken language. Deaf blindness. Deaf blindness means I can't say that word today. Okay, so we're talking about the combination of both hearing and visual impairments, which causes such severe communication and other developmental and educational needs that they cannot be accommodated in special education programs solely for children with deafness or children with blindness. So typically children with deaf blindness, we don't really have a whole lot of resources in the state of California for children with deaf blindness. Educationally, we don't have a lot of deaf-blind interveners. It is just a real need that we have. However, if your child does qualify under the category of deaf blindness, I highly recommend reaching out to the California Deaf Blind Services. Invite them to your meeting. They will come to your meeting free of charge. They will come, will do trainings. They're a wonderful resource. But I would highly recommend that if your child is in need of services for both visual impairment and also deafness, getting in contact with them, because in my experience as an advocate, most IEP teams are very underexperienced in addressing the needs of deafness and blindness and low vision, let alone students who are deaf-blind. And having had a couple clients who meet eligibility under that category, it is a blessing to have access to California Deaf Blind Services. They are a wonderful resource. Okay, just a few more slides here. I know we're right at 11 o'clock. We only have about 3 more slides, so just hang in there with me. So the eligibility determination meeting process, introductions are made. So everyone who's present in the meeting is going to explain who they are and why they're present, their role in the meeting. They're going to go through the reports, and they're going to explain how they determine eligibility based on their area of expertise and what their eligibility recommendation is. Then if they are making recommendations, they're going to explain what those are. Ask questions. This is your meeting. This is your child. Don't feel like you just have to sit there and take it and listen and then ask everything later. It's okay to interrupt and say, what does that mean? Refer to the notes that you made on the reports. Remember that you reviewed them in advance, right? And it's okay if you need more than one meeting, but if it feels like it's going in that direction, try to stop the meeting about 10 minutes before your scheduled end time and schedule another meeting before everyone leaves, especially if you have a large team, because it's really hard to get everyone together if you don't do it that way. And remember that you as the parent or guardian are just as equally valuable a team member as anybody else at that table. Just because you're a parent doesn't mean you are not also an expert. You have a PhD in your child. Okay, so this is just an example of the process. We go through assessment. We have the meeting. At that meeting, we determine, is that child eligible or not eligible? If that child is eligible, great. We develop an IEP. If that child is not eligible, You have two choices as a parent or guardian. You can say, okay, I can see why you guys came to that decision, and I agree with your decision. But I still think my child needs accommodations. They need access to their environment. They need an FM system. They need an ASL interpreter, but that's all they need. This is a very rare situation where I as an advocate recommend this, but let's just say this is how the conversation goes. Then you develop a 504 plan. Let's say you as a parent say, no way, guys, Johnny definitely needs an IEP. I do not agree that he does not qualify for any of these services. I want what's called an IEE. That's called an IEE. It stands for an independent educational evaluation. That's when you formally say to the school, I don't agree with your decision. I want somebody else to repeat the assessments and tell me whether or not they were conducted correctly and if they come to the same conclusions or not. And so that's the process that I would recommend most parents go through if their child who's deaf or hard of hearing is found ineligible. The three main laws that we typically interact with schools, IDEA, that was the Individuals with in Disabilities Education Act. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, that's the 504 plan that only provides accommodations to a student. That's it, no services. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's not, okay, we qualify for an IEP, so we don't qualify for ADA protections anymore, and Rehabilitation Act doesn't apply anymore. They all interact at all times. So while one might be more important, depending on which one we're going to qualify a student under, it doesn't mean that the protections aren't always in place at all times. It's just a matter of if there is an issue, under which law are we going to pursue either a complaint, or are we going to try to enforce our rights? So it's not that you don't have Americans with Disability rights if you have an IEP, or that if you have a 504, you don't have ADA protections. Those laws all kind of overlap in the public school setting. Okay, 504 plans. Those are born out of a law called the Rehabilitation Act. It's a very old law from the 70s. To be protected under the 504, a student is determined to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or they have a record of such impairment, or they're regarded as having such impairment. So that means you don't even have to have doctor's note that says you have something as of an official diagnosis. The goal of that law was to provide accommodations to students. So it's an equal access law and a non-discrimination law. As of 2009, if you have mitigating measures, meaning if a child has ADHD and they take medication for that ADHD that effectively manages their symptoms, that does not mean that they do not qualify for a 504 plan. That's different for an IEP. For an IEP, we can consider things that minimize the impact of the disability, but for a 504, as of 2009, the 504 protections are still in place regardless, regardless of the effects of any mitigating measures like hearing aids or glasses or medications. You would still fall under the protections of the 504. And you're still entitled to a free and appropriate public education. Okay, and if your deaf child is found ineligible for an IEP, again, you're going to provide a written request for an independent educational evaluation, and you're going to ask for prior written notice without unnecessary delay. So there's no specific timeline in the law, but under what we call case law, meaning how the courts have kind of determined what is a reasonable amount of time without unnecessary delay, it's typically around 30 days. So that means that the district has to send you a letter agreeing to provide funding for the independent educational evaluations, or they have to file due process and defend their evaluation reports. What you can do is develop a 504 plan to implement accommodations, and that can include classroom supports like an ASL interpreter or an FM system, or both. Or you can pursue both things simultaneously. You don't have to choose a 504 plan and not also request an IEE. In fact, I would say you can pursue the 504 so you have something in place for your child. But I would say an IEE is appropriate to request if your child with a hearing loss is found ineligible. Worst case scenario, the district denies your request, and then you can choose at such a time to either rescind your request for the IEE or go through due process. And if that's the case, I would recommend reaching out to NorCal and getting advice from one of their parent advocates about how to move forward. All right, I know we're very short in time, so if anyone does need to leave, I will leave the option to for anyone who wants to stay and ask questions. But for right now, I'm going to ask Jermaine to put the survey up. We have a QR code for survey. You can provide us with your feedback about how today's presentation went. And then I also want to let anyone know that we do have 2 more trainings coming up. November 16th, we're doing an IEP basics training. We're going to go from the beginning to the end of the IEP document on November 16th. And then we're going to do a deep dive into IEP goal writing on November 30th, because that's a really important part of the IEP, and it's often the most rushed and the least understood. So hopefully you can join us for those. And then we have parent support groups coming up in 2024, and hopefully you can join us for those as well. But again, I'll ask that our QR code go up for our survey. And then if anyone does have any questions, I will make myself available for the next few minutes or so to answer any questions.